Spent the last couple of minutes sorting out a crackly microphone. Great. Welcome, good evening. Welcome to week 3 of Alpha. For those of us who are here on site at Rood, and for anyone that's joining in online as well, it's really lovely to welcome you to the third week. We can take a little break after this week for half term, but we've got a really good evening this evening, which I'm really looking forward to. Some of us are here in the building, and we'll be having a short presentation and then a little comfort break, and then we'll grow into discussion groups. But obviously, some of us are joining in online as well. There's a little swap around in who's doing what tonight. So Beth is going to be hosting the Zoom room for those of you who are online, and Dan is here, who's going to be leading Beth's group with Morton, just for a little change. So, but this evening we are going to be thinking. Idea.
I have no idea. I have no idea.
Why did Jesus die?
Jesus, I should really know this.
Big question for early in the morning, isn't it?
Jesus died for people, other people.
He's saving us.
Was it Pontius Pilate probably got a bit jealous of Jesus getting all the birds, so...
We all die. People die for different reasons.
I think it was supposed to be like for our sins, wasn't it?
Jesus died because people didn't agree with him.
Well, probably fear is why he died more than anything else.
Didn't he, sacrifice himself on the cross? So, it's his choice.
Jesus died because of people's beliefs.
That's up for discussion.
Everybody dies. No one lives forever.
Great. Oh, there, I'm very loud now. I've got a different microphone, so hopefully we're going to be doing a bit better than we did a couple of minutes ago. I love the Vox Pops. My favourite one was, I should know this. That's great, wasn't it? That was great. I should know this. Well, okay. We are continuing our journey on Alpha over these few weeks about the ideas at the heart of the Christian faith. And so far, what we've looked at is we've considered why might a person take this journey? Why might a person even begin to wrestle with these things? Why not just kind of live your life, and then when it's over, and let's not worry about it too much? And then last week we began to ask ourselves the question, so if we want to make this journey, if we want to think about this, then we start at the very beginning, which, as the song goes, is a very good place to start, with the question of who is Jesus. And how could we know that? How might we know whether any of the things we read about, the claims that people make about Jesus are true? But we move on today to actually to deal with the event around which everything else resolves. But before that we do that, let me ask you a quick question, which is, I wish this was a joke. It's not a joke, but it sounds like a joke. Let's see. So what do Madonna, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Wayne Rooney all have in common? Now, it's not a joke. If it were a joke, it would go something like this. Madonna, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Wayne Rooney walk into a bar. The barman says, is this some kind of a joke? No, you see, that's a terrible joke. What do they all have in common? Madonna, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Wayne Rooney? Well, actually, the thing they have in common is that they all wear a cross. They all wear a crucifix. And that's so normal within our society, you might not even think about it. It might not even be something you would even register. But actually, if you did think about it, you might think to yourself, that is a pretty unusual thing to do. I mean, a cross is a symbol of a particularly horrible and violent form of execution, one that is outlawed, that is banned outright by things like the Geneva Convention. It's so awful. Why would anybody wear a symbol of that around their neck as the chief identifier of their faith. And yet this is the symbol at the heart of Christianity. Actually, what lies at the heart of Christianity is everything associated with the cross. That one of the chief services that we have here in our churches, in most churches around the world, is a communion service, where we actually take the time to remember not just the life and the person of Jesus, but his death and what happened next. It's often said sometimes that the most great people who kind of changed the world are remembered for the lives they led. But actually, one of the chief things we remember about Jesus is not just his life, but as much for his death. Now, you may think, well, this is a little bit morbid. Why would we talk about that? Why would we be bothered about that? Well, it's worth reflecting that. If you, we gave away some Gospels last week. If you have a read of the Gospels, in most of the Gospels, a third of the material there is taken up with the events surrounding Jesus' death. In Mark's Gospel, I think I gave away a couple of Mark's Gospels last week, it's half. Half of Mark's gospel are the events surrounding Jesus' death and what happened next. And it's this idea that when Jesus died on the cross, in the crucifixion, that wasn't the end of the story. That something happened 3 days later that turned the world upside down. So, let's just have a little think about what happened. What happened at the death and afterwards of Jesus? I just need to point out that this is an artist's impression. This is of the events of the first Easter story. So as the events of the first Easter story, as they are recorded in the Gospels, they go something like this. After about 3 years of his public ministry, of traveling around, teaching, talking to people, some of the stories you may well have heard of, things like the feeding of the 5,000, the walking on water, that kind of thing. That Jesus was arrested by the Jewish leaders in Rome just after dusk on a Thursday evening. It was the weekend of the Passover, and then over that night was put on trial, first in the Jewish courts, and then bandied about before eventually early in the morning being brought before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, where he was accused of blasphemy, and the Jewish leaders asked that according to their deal with the Romans, they weren't allowed to put anyone to death for their crimes, but they asked Pilate if he would have Jesus put to death on their behalf. Pilate, who is in the long line of men who did not listen to his wife, eventually agreed to this, and that early on the Friday morning, Jesus was taken outside the walls of Jerusalem and was crucified, as many of you will know the story, between two thieves, and it took him a few hours. Actually, it was quite short by crucifixion standards, but by about lunchtime, a little early in the afternoon, he had died. His body was taken down, and because it was a holy weekend, they had to deal with it all very, very quickly. It was the Passover. He was hurriedly put into a borrowed tomb. A large stone was rolled in front of it, which was affixed with the Roman seal, and soldiers were placed outside it. And as far as anybody knew, that was the end of the story. That was the end of the Jesus mission, the Jesus experiment. Everybody went home. Some people feeling quite smug about themselves because they managed to get rid of a troublemaker, but obviously Jesus' closest friends and associates, his disciples, their world torn apart. The Friday past Saturday, past the Sabbath, the Passover, and nothing where you couldn't do anything. And 2 days later, on the first Sunday morning, would have been the first day of the week. Sundays didn't work in those days like Sundays work today. When some of the women who were part of Jesus' traveling group of followers went down, because it had all been done in such a rush that none of the proper arrangements for a burial had been made. They wanted to go and make it right and do something about it. When they got there, they found the stone rolled away and the tomb empty, empty actually except for the wrap, the cloths in which he had been wrapped. Now, do you like murder mysteries? Yes? We're going to do the opposite of a murder mystery. We're going to do someone was dead, but he's not there anymore. What might have happened? I don't know if you've been to see the new Hercule Poirot movie. We're going to play Hercule Poirot for a few moments. What might have happened between that Friday and that Sunday to get us to the point of the empty tomb? As you will imagine, after 2,000 years, people have quite a lot of theories. I promise you, people have quite a lot of theories. Let me share with you some of the, some of the most common ones. So one of the most common ones, which actually is actually shared by a large number of people from some of the other great world faiths, was that he didn't really die. He kind of swooned, and after a nice little sleep, he felt better, and he got up and kind of rolled back the stone and carried on his way, and nobody really knows. And all of the resurrection appearances are not resurrection appearances. They're just him come back to life. Okay, that's number one. He didn't really die. Now, there are, as we will go along, you will see there are some facts that we need to deal with as we go through some of these hypotheses. Facts are friends, as we know. And so the first fact, there's a couple of facts that make that hypothesis a difficult one to sustain. The first is this, is that the Romans were very good at crucifying people. They didn't really get it wrong. For those of you that have got a background in the military, you will understand these were not particularly passionate people that really cared about it. These were just soldiers doing their job. And for those Roman soldiers that day, their job was to crucify 3 men outside Rome. And the problem for them was been that if they didn't do it properly, they might have found themselves up on the cross the next day. I mean, the penalty for not doing your job properly in the Roman army was not a pleasant one. So we know that they would have done it properly. And actually, if you read the accounts of the crucifixion, because they wanted to do it quickly, this is a bit unpleasant and a bit gory, I'm sorry about this, but what they did was they actually broke the legs of the thieves that were hanging on either side of Jesus so that the end would come more quickly. But then when they came to Jesus, we're told that as far as they could see, he'd already died. But just to be sure, what they did was that they stuck a spear in his side, and out came, and you can read about this in the Gospels, it says, out came blood and water. Now that wasn't blood and water. It's what happens in the blood when the different parts of the blood, the plasma and the red blood cells start to separate, which only happens after death. But actually it looks like blood and water because some of it's clear and some of it's not. So we're given this really compelling piece of evidence. They wouldn't have, the original writers wouldn't have known that it was what it was. They wouldn't have known the medical reality for what it was. But even so, we're given this really compelling picture that actually he couldn't have just swooned. It couldn't have been that because the evidence in front of the soldiers was that he was already gone. Okay, so that's hypothesis number one. Okay, what about number two? Okay, so let's say, all right, so he was dead. Okay, let's try and work this through. So he was dead and he was buried. So maybe someone stole the body. Maybe like somebody stole the body. Who might that be? Well, who might that be? The authorities might have stolen the body. We don't know why, but for some reason they would want to get away with it and just be done with it, have this thing over. So they'll pay off the guards, stage something or other, and just take the body. Okay. Now, the problem with that hypothesis is that when the rumors started that Jesus had come back to life, there would have been quite a simple way to kind of quash those rumors. Quite simple. Middle of Jerusalem, Monday afternoon. If the authorities had stolen the body, all they'd need to do was bring it out again, and that would be the end of that. But in fact, they didn't do that. Again, you can read about it in the Gospels. They paid the guards off and told them to say that the disciples had stolen the body. Maybe the disciples did steal the body then. So maybe they wanted to create they decided they were going to do something about it. Again, there's an interesting problem. There's a couple of problems with that. One was that these were a broken group of people who in the space of 48 hours were not going to be able to come up with an Ocean's 11 style heist and pull it off with armed Roman guards, the whacking great stone, and be able to get away with it all. It just wasn't. It's not really believable. But there's a kind of bigger reason than that, which is that nearly all of Jesus' disciples ended up dying for their faith, most of them at the hands of the Romans too. And if the likelihood that they would have been prepared to die for what they knew to be a lie is pretty far-fetched. The idea that they could have kept this conspiracy going for the whole of their lifetimes and been willing to die for it. Chuck Colson was a member of Richard Nixon's government when it fell, and he was implicated in the Watergate scandal. His autobiography of his story is really interesting. It's a really good book to read. He was sent to prison for his involvement in the Watergate scandal, and then in prison, he read the Bible and became a Christian. And one of the things that convinced him was that it took less than a fortnight or so. It took for the conspiracy around the Watergate scandal to unravel, because too many people realized that it was going to cost them too much to keep up the lie. And as he read the Gospels, he realized that there was no way that group of people were going to be able to live with that kind of conspiracy for the whole of their lives. He realized he concluded that there had to be some truth in it. One other possible, maybe someone else did. Maybe like grave robbers did or something. I don't know. Maybe some third party that we don't know of. The difficulty again with that is this piece of cloth here, which is that all the accounts say the tomb was empty apart from the cloth. The reality was the cloth was the only thing of any value in there. There's no way that somebody would have come in there, unraveled the body, taken the body and left the cloth, if what you wanted was something of value. A dead body in the ancient world was of no value whatsoever. Unclean, but the cloth might have been something. So the fact the cloth was left and the body was taken. So we're left with the conclusion that something else must have happened. We explore all the different avenues for the fact that sensible people who live in the real world, who know that people don't come back from the dead, ordinary people that see death around them in ways that we couldn't even imagine. No one, you're not going to see anyone being crucified on the Peak Lane on the way to Fareham, on a Saturday afternoon. We just don't see those kinds of things. These people saw that. That was just very common. That was part of their experience. Sensible people who know the difference between life and death came down to the tomb on the Sunday morning, and he wasn't there. And then over a series of days and weeks, he started to appear to them. And at first they thought it was a ghost. They thought, like many people might think, it's just a mass psychosis, a mass hallucination. That's exactly what they thought. And again, you get to read the gospel accounts. He would stand in front of them and say, "I'm not a ghost. Give me something to eat." It says they gave him a piece of boiled fish. I know of one man who became a Christian because he couldn't believe that anyone would eat boiled fish, let alone the ghost of Jesus. And gradually we see over time, over those 4 weeks immediately after Easter, a transformational impact. That this little group of people who'd lived with Jesus for these 3 years were changed from being, fearful and afraid to somehow realizing that something completely wonderful, completely unexpected, completely impossible, completely unbelievable had happened among them. And that the one they had known was dead had been brought back to life. One of the things that people often think about is the impact that had on that group of people. These were fishermen, farmers, Some of them were collaborators with the Romans. Some of them would love to overthrow the Romans. And yet in the space of a few weeks, they went from being a little huddle of scared people to being part of the fledgling movement that spread, the first generation of Christians that spread Christianity all the way around the known world. By the year 60, 70, 80, we see it into Rome, into India, into Africa. We see an explosive movement that all began in Jerusalem at that first Easter, when the disciples met Jesus raised from the dead. So let's have a think about that. Let's just have a think about why. That's something of the how. Let's think about why. If this is the central event of Christianity, if this is the central event around which everything else revolves, why is it such a big deal? Why does it matter? Why does it matter that Jesus died and was raised from the dead? There's a couple of different answers. There's a couple of different ways to think about this, and I want to just touch on each of them as briefly as I can. The first immediate impact for those who saw Jesus risen, raised with their own eyes, was that it proved that everything he'd said was true. I mean, they believed him up to that point. I mean, he said all these nice things about loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself and all of that. And they were pretty serious about it all, but they all ran away when he was arrested, and none of them were there when he was crucified. So clearly they weren't quite as all in as we might think. But when they saw him raised, when they met the risen Christ, it was almost as if something clicked over in them. That everything he'd said about God and everything he'd said about himself was true. That it was all real. That it was more than just nice stories and feeding 5,000 people with a Happy Meal. It was more than just what they'd seen. That actually it was all true. And that became their message. This is what we heard and saw among us. And as they spread around the Mediterranean, and we're here to tell you that because God raised Jesus from the dead, it's all true. But then as they reflected a little bit more on it, and you can read all about this in the New Testament. You can read about how this message kind of developed. They started to reflect on this idea that you will see again and again in the writings of the first generation of Christians, that Jesus died for our sins. He died for all that is wrong in the world. Now, sin is a very churchy word, okay? It's a word that most of us will have very mixed feelings about. It's often a word used these days to describe something like ice cream. Ice cream, it is sinfully good, okay? Or it's often a word that we use to describe terrible things, but maybe not me, terrible things. What do the first generation of Christians mean when they say something like Jesus died for our sins? Sin is everything that's wrong in the world. Everything that's wrong in the world. From the micro, from the everyday way that we treat each other and our world badly, up to the macro. Our tendency to want to wage war against each other. Our seeming inability to be able to love God and love the people around us and love the world in which we live. That kind of seam that seems to run through us, that sometimes we wish we could pretend isn't there, but which seems to shape so much of the world that we experience, from the person that cuts us up on the motorway through to the fact that we're about to go to war with Russia or something, I don't know. From the very small to the very big and everything in between. What mars our world, what mars our lives, which makes us less than we could be, less than often we want to be, is what the Bible calls sin. The Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn put it like this. He said, the dividing line between good and evil doesn't run through states or between classes. It has no geographical boundary, but it cuts through every human heart. We all find the reality of both good and evil within us. But sometimes we don't really like acknowledging that. We don't like, we want to kind of play it off a little bit. We want to kind of go, oh yeah, no, I'm not that, I'm not a sinful person. I've got some friends that moved into a poorer community in the north, in Manchester. This probably been about 20 years ago now, and they were part of a new initiative in that community to try and, start new churches and meet people and try to kind of act and work for the benefit of what was at the time one of the most deprived communities in Manchester. About 2 days after they moved in, they got burgled. They got their house turned over and their stuff nicked. They were warned this might happen, so they kind of, put a brave face on and kind of got on with living in that community, living among the people of that community, loving and getting to know them. And after a few years of living there, they kind of worked out, they reckon they knew who did it, who turned their house over. They kind of had a good inkling through things that people had said. And then this young man actually got sent to prison for some other unrelated offences. And because this couple were good Christian people, the wife decided to go and visit this young man in prison just to see how he was doing, knowing eventually get back out and move back into the community. And so she went to see him in prison, and they were talking. And then he said, "Can I tell you something?" And she said, "Oh yeah, what is it?" And he said, when you got burgled when you first moved in? She said, "Oh yeah, what is it?" He says, "That was me." "Oh," she said, looking surprised. And then he said, "But I've still got my morals. I didn't go through your knicker drawer." That is a true story. I promise you, every single word of it is a true story. That is the morality of a scoundrel trying to cling on to some sense of I'm not that bad really. You're in jail. I'm not that bad really. I didn't go through your knicker drawer. And yet sometimes that's the way that we behave as humanity. We somehow want to find a way to kind of, talk our way out of the things that we do. As if we could somehow stand in front of God and say, well, I'm not that bad, really. And one of the things that sometimes often people say is we say, well, what's the standard? What's the standard? If we look at the pillar, what's the standard of right and wrong? So if we, what is it? Is the standard Mother Teresa? Is it Desmond Tutu? What's the standard? Well, how would we measure ourselves? Where would we be on the pillar? On the pillar. Let's say that kind of Mother Teresa's at the top, and we won't discuss who we put at the bottom. You probably have your own opinion about that. Where I'll be somewhere in the middle, I'll be all right. So the problem is that's not the standard. The standard of what's right and wrong is not the best or the worst person you can think of. The standard is the standard that God sets. And because God is perfect, actually, he's not at the top of the pillar. He's like on the moon. I mean, that's the difference when we discuss right and wrong, what it means to be people who accept and live with the reality of our flawed human nature. This is how one of the early Christian writers put it. He said, honestly, if we're honest, we've all sinned. We all fall short of the glory of God. We may feel better or worse than the people around us, but that's not the standard. The standard is the nature, the character of God. So what is it about, and we're going to come into land just now, what is it about Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection that does something about any of this? Well, it's an idea that we can spend a little bit of time exploring in our groups, but it's what the Christian writers call the self-substitution of God. But because I'm the problem, I can't also be the answer. And so God himself provided the answer. He himself takes our place. He takes all of the rubbish, all of the junk, and somehow takes it on upon himself. So the possibility exists that we might be forgiven for all that's wrong, for all the stuff that we carry, and we might begin the possibility of being changed so that we can work for good in the world, free of some of the impulses, free of the worst of our impulses. This is how The same writer, Paul, puts it. Speaking of God, speaking of Jesus. God made him who had no sin. The one person who lived a perfect, sinless life. Even when they put him on trial, they couldn't find a single thing against him. The charges for which he was eventually prosecuted and executed were trumped up, invented charges, twisting his words. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. You may have read the famous Charles Dickens novel, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. One of the aspects of the novel, A Tale of Two Cities, is that two of the main characters, Sidney Carton and Charles Darnay, look uncannily like each other. One of them's a bad man, Sidney Carton, and one of them's a good man, Charles Darnay. And in the end, Charles Darnay ends up getting imprisoned in the Bastille in France, and towards the climax of the novel, just as he's about to be taken out and had his head taken off as part of the French Revolution, Sidney Carton says to him, "I will take your place." They swap clothes, and Charles Darnay is dragged out in a coach and brought back to England, where he's able to grow old with his family in safety. And in his place, Sidney Carton goes to the guillotine. And you may have heard of the words, his final words on the way there. Do you know these words? "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known." In A Tale of Two Cities, a bad man substitutes himself for a good man. But on the cross, a perfect man substituted himself for an imperfect humanity, so that we might have the chance to be forgiven and to come back into a relationship with God and to start over again the work of making this world more of what it should be. We are going to take a break in just a couple of minutes, and then we're going to go into our groups. For those of you that are online and want to join in with the Zoom room, hopefully you've got the code already. Just a couple of little bits of housekeeping before we do that. The first is to say there won't be an Alpha next week. We're going to take a little break for half term, and then we'll come back and we'll carry on our journey. I think some of the rest of the team will be doing some of the presentations, so you won't have to listen to me quite so much. But then just to say that we are going to have a Saturday morning together where we talked a little bit about God, we talked a little bit about Jesus, so we're going to talk a little bit about the Holy Spirit. Who is the Holy Spirit? The Saturday morning is going to be on Saturday the 5th of March. So it's going to be the Saturday, not the Saturday of half term, but the Saturday after half term. It will be 9:30 till about 1. And normally we'd go off somewhere, but we're going to do it here because that makes the streaming and all of the tech side easier. And there'll be, if you show up at 9:30, I predict you'll get given something nice to eat. And probably if we go till about 12:15, you'll probably be given something nice to eat at the end of the day as well. I know that not all of us will be able to make that. Some of us will already have commitments that day, but if you would just make sure at some point this evening you get out your diaries and put Saturday the 5th of March in, and we'll spend that morning as a little extra session in the middle of our final 3 sessions after half term. But right now we're going to take a little bit of comfort break. Thank you so much for joining in online, those of you that are with us on Facebook as well, and for those of us in the building, we'll take a little comfort break, come back together, grab yourselves a cup of tea and coffee, and we'll come back together in our groups in about 5 minutes.